Black people didn't just walk through medieval Europe. We wore the armor and swore the oaths. We weren't just in the castles, we guarded the thrones. You've been fed this dry, dusty fairy tale. Europe in the Middle Ages, pale faces, pale nights, pale stories, as if the whole continent was allergic to melanin. That's not history, that's editing, because when steel clashed and banners rose, when kings were trembling and kingdoms were breaking, there were black hands gripping European swords, black riders in chainmail, black commanders on war horses staring down enemies who never expected to see them leading the charge. But you got the Disney version. They erased the Black Knights, then told you we were just slaves. They buried the evidence under centuries of silence and called it Western civilization. Let me talk to you plain. How you gonna tell me Rome stretched into Africa, Islam stretched into Europe, trade routes ran from the Sahara straight into European courts, but somehow not a single black warrior ever crossed that line? Stop it. There were black knights in the courts of Europe, black generals in Christian armies, black warriors in crusader mail, black men with titles, land, and armor so bright it blinded the lies that came after. They've been hiding in the margins of old paintings, misnamed in chronicles, coded as Moor, Saracen, Ethiopian, anything but what they were. Knights, lords, commanders, men of rank and respect in a world they now pretend we never touched. You've seen the myths. Now it's time for the receipts. This is not about fantasy. This is not about representation. This is about restoration. Because once you realize there were black knights in medieval Europe, the whole script of "we had nothing to do with it" falls apart. The lie that our story is only chains and plantations starts to crack, and suddenly your reflection shows up in the armor they swore was never yours. Stay right here. We're about to ride straight into the Middle Ages, kick open the castle gates, and drag our people's names back into the light. First, let's kill the lie. Yeah, I said it. Not us. The lie. This fairy tale that medieval Europe was all pale faces and powdered wigs before powder even existed. That every knight in shining armor looked like he was born in a snowstorm. Nah. History been edited like a bad mixtape. They lowered the bass, turned down the melanin, and told you the track was authentic. Let's rewind it. Picture Europe in the Middle Ages, cold stone castles, damp halls, muddy roads, plagues creeping through the streets, kings wearing crowns but broke in the treasury, peasants praying for bread, priests selling forgiveness like a side hustle. Now picture Africa in that same era. Sun hitting gold roofs in Mali. Libraries in Timbuktu, so deep you could drown in the knowledge. Scholars writing books while Europe could barely sign its own name. In Europe, they had castles. In Africa, we had cities. In Europe, they had lords. In Africa, we had emperors. In Europe, they had knights begging kings for land. In Africa, kings begged our traders for salt and gold. So when Europe went looking for muscle, for skill on horseback, for men who could swing steel with discipline, who did they look at? They looked south. They looked across the water. They looked at us. Let's talk Moors. Not the watered-down version, not the dark foreigners, footnote your history teacher mumbled through. I'm talking black Moors, North Africa, West Africa, skin kissed by the sun, armor glinting under Spanish skies. They didn't just walk into Europe. They rode in, hooves pounding, banners flying, science, math, architecture in their saddlebags. While Europe was tossing waste in the streets, the Moors were building aqueducts, lighting up cities, teaching them how to bathe more than once a season. In Spain, Al-Andalus, you had black generals, black scholars, black commanders holding castles on land that wasn't even calling itself Spain yet. They weren't side characters. They were the plot. But this part they really buried. Some of those Moors, they weren't just rulers, they were knights, sworn, trained, respected, black steel in white kingdoms. When Europe needed warriors for its holy wars, crusades, reconquista, all those God told us to do it campaigns. Black men were on the front lines, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, sometimes as the secret weapon nobody wanted to admit was black. You had African cavalry so deadly, European kings hired them, then hired painters to bleach them on the canvas later. You ever seen those old paintings with the mysterious dark knight in the corner? The Saracen with the lance? That ain't fantasy. That's a receipt. Let's draw the contrast clean. In Africa, a warrior could be a scholar, sword in one hand, manuscript in the other. You could protect a city at sunrise and debate philosophy at sunset. In Europe, a knight was usually a land thug with a title. Fight, drink, tax the peasants, call it honor. In Africa, we were mapping the stars, measuring the earth, counting years with more precision than the calendars that would later claim to discover us. In Europe, they were arguing if bathing was sinful. So when African men rode into Europe in armor, they weren't just bringing muscle, they were bringing a standard, a different idea of what power could look like. And that scared folks. So centuries later, when it came time to paint the past, they airbrushed the blackout. They turned knights into blonde, legends and our people into shadows. But here's the thing about shadows, they only exist when there's light. We are that light. This series, we're not here to imagine black knights. We're here to remember them, call them by name, drag them out the margins and put them back at the center of the frame. Europe tried to claim the Middle Ages like it was their private movie. But Africa funded half the production, trained half the cast, and wrote scenes they cut from the final edit. The Black Knight at the heart of German legend. The African commander who rode through Spain. The dark-skinned saint they turned into a mystery. The Moorish captains who made Christian kings nervous and Muslim courts proud. One by one, we pull their files. One by one, we say their names, because the Middle Ages weren't just white winters. They were black thunder. And it's time you heard it roll. Turn the page. Next up, we put faces to the armor. First, let's strip the shine off the fairy tale. When they say medieval Europe, your mind pulls up pale faces, pointy chins, stringy hair under iron helmets, accent straight out of some British drama. They trained you to see snow and forget the sun, but on those same battlefields, under those same banners, in those same stone castles, you've been shown 1,000 times without a single black face in frame. We were there, not as background, not as sidekicks, as knights, black, armored, respected, and feared. Let's talk about the Moor, Europe's favorite blur word, a word they used like smoke, so you could never quite see the face behind it. Moor meant Muslim. Moor meant North African. Moor meant dark-skinned foreigner. Moor meant we don't want to say African out loud, but step closer, wipe the fog off the glass. Those Moors were Berbers, Arabs, and yes, Africans so dark the sun looked like family. Soldiers, generals, cavalry, so clean and deadly they rewrote the rules of war. You've seen them without knowing. That black figure on a horse in the old paintings, that dark knight on a European coat of arms, that exotic warrior in the tapestry, face brown or straight up black, with a lance and a halo of European fear around him. That's not random. That's memory trying not to die. While Europe was choking on mud and plague, Africa was running empires like well-oiled machines. They call it the Dark Ages. But tell me this, dark for who? In Mali, gold flowed so heavy Mansa Musa crashed economies. In Songhai, scholars debated science and faith under lamplight. In Nubia and Ethiopia, kingdoms raised churches from stone and painted saints with brown faces that looked like uncles and aunties. Over there, Europe had castles that smelled like smoke and sewage, kings who couldn't read, priests arguing about angels on pinheads while rats held family reunions in the pantry. Over here, Africa had libraries, universities, astronomers tracking stars, merchants moving silk, salt, and stories from the Sahara to the Nile. So when African warriors rode into Europe as mercenaries, allies, conquerors, or honored guests, they weren't stepping up, they were stepping down. From empires to kingdoms, from stone cities to wooden forts, from libraries to monasteries hoarding 3 books and a rumor. You've met him in stories. They just never told you he was you. The Black Knight in European legends, mysterious, masked, unstoppable, sometimes noble, sometimes dangerous, always powerful. They turned him into a symbol, a shadow, a trope, but that shadow was cast by real men, African and Afro-descended knights who rode with Christian kings and Muslim sultans, archers from Nubia, horsemen from the Maghreb, elite guards from African courts hired by European crowns because when war came, skill didn't care what color your skin was, but fear did. There were black knights in Spain when African-led armies crossed into Iberia and rewired European architecture, math, and medicine. There were black knights in Sicily and Italy where African soldiers served under Norman and Arab rulers, their presence so real that European art started painting saints and soldiers with skin like polished mahogany. There were black knights moving through crusader armies, some as allies, some as enemies, but always as proof. Europe was never as white as Hollywood swore it was. Picture this, a cold European dawn. Fog sitting low like it's afraid to rise, steel clinking in the distance, a village huddled behind wooden walls, praying to a god they barely understand. Then they hear it. Hooves. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Rhythmic, confident. Not the clumsy stomp of local militia, but the smooth, deadly thunder of trained cavalry. Out of the mist. Banners with foreign script. Armor catching the weak sun. And at the front, a black man on a war horse wrapped in fine cloth and chainmail, eyes scanning the land like he's reading it. To that village, he was a nightmare. To his people, he was a professional. To history, he became a rumor. That's how we get erased. First, they fear you. Then they copy you. Then they pretend you were never there. They'll tell you Europe advanced Africa, brought civilization, brought order. But before Europe even figured out proper plumbing, African engineers were redirecting rivers, African doctors were doing surgery, African architects were designing mosques and palaces that still make tourists whisper today. When African knights rode into European lands, they brought more than swords. They brought tactics, they brought engineering, they brought knowledge of maps, stars, and supply lines. Europe learned from Africa, then turned around and wrote the textbooks like they were the teachers. That's the contrast they'll never put in the movie. Europe, muddy roads, half-educated kings, fear of the unknown. Africa, trade routes, written laws, armies that moved like choreography. So when you see a black knight in a painting, or a dark face hidden in a medieval mural, understand that's not a glitch in the matrix. That's the truth bleeding through the lie. You can't sell the myth of white genius if you admit black excellence stood beside it with a sharper sword and a better tailor. So they blurred us into Moors. They turned us into Saracens. They shifted our names, lightened our faces in new paintings, left out the descriptions when they translated the chronicles. Erase the African, keep the armor. Erase the rider, keep the legend. But the cracks are still there, in the coats of arms with black heads and black kings, in the stories of dark-skinned knights serving European courts, in the records of African envoys arriving with retinues, so regal European scribes ran out of adjectives. They tried to bury the evidence, but the past is a stubborn ancestor. It keeps knocking. You were told Europe was white, knighthood was white, chivalry was white. I'm here to tell you, the story was whitewashed. The iron wasn't. Next up, we stop talking in general and start calling names. You've met the armor. Now we go hunting for the men inside it. First, let's deal with the lie. because Europe been walking around like it invented night. Like honor, steel, courage all came with blue eyes and a British accent. Nah, we telling it straight today. Picture this. The year is dusty with centuries, castles breathing fog, church bells arguing with the wind, and on some cold European field where the mud got more bodies than crops, you see a banner snap in the air. Lion, cross, or some royal animal that never paid taxes. And under that banner you see him, not pale, not rosy-cheeked, not out some perfume commercial, dark, a black man in full plate, helmet under his arm, wool cloak on his shoulders, chainmail kissing his neck. Yeah, a black knight. In Europe, on their soil, in their history, in the chapters they forgot to print. Let's call a few names since they love facts so much. They talk about the Moors like they were just tourists in Spain. Nah, those were North African kings, generals, scholars, rolling into Europe with libraries, science, and swagger. You got black commanders in Al-Andalus, black soldiers in the courts of Castile, African faces in Italian city-states, black saints painted on church walls before somebody got nervous and started bleaching halos and skin tones. They don't tell you that Saracen in their old books wasn't just enemy. Half the time it meant those dark ones from the south who keep beating us at war in math. See, Europe likes to pretend Africa only showed up in chains, but before the auction blocks, you had African captains riding through their land strapped in steel. While Europe was still arguing about bathing, Timbuktu had universities. While their kings were eating with dirty hands, Mansa Musa was walking into their world, so rich he broke economies. So when African men showed up in their armies, in their courts, in their churches, it wasn't charity, it was talent, it was skill, it was presence. Let's talk contrast for a second. In Europe, a knight had to beg some lord for land, swear to a king who barely knew his name, ride for a church that told him God looked nothing like him. In Africa, warriors weren't just steel and horses. They were bloodlines, clans, titles that meant something. You had cavalry in Kanem-Bornu, shield walls in Congo, regiments in Ethiopia praying in gayas before marching out. Europe wrote poems about chivalry. Africa lived codes of honor so old, they didn't need a French word on top. Now, here's the part that stings. When a black man put on armor in Europe, he wasn't a fantasy. He was a problem. Because once you see a black knight, you can't keep selling the lie that Africa only knew chains and chaos. You can't keep pretending black means servant when history painted black men with lances, not leashes. So they did what they always do when the truth don't fit the script. They blurred it. They buried names. They lost records. They scraped paint off church walls. They turned black saints into tanned Europeans. They made Moor sound like monster, made African sound like outsider, and when that wasn't enough, they just stopped talking about it. Silence is a weapon too. It erases without blood on the floor. But history got a stubborn memory. You still see black riders and faded frescoes in Italy. You still see dark-skinned kings standing at the manger in old German churches. You still see African faces in coats of arms on coins in the margins of manuscripts where monks drew what they saw, not what the future wanted. You see Saint Maurice, black soldier of the Roman army, patron of knights and empires, painted in full armor, sword in hand, skin dark as truth. They won't say his name loud, because once they do, the whole story starts to crack. Understand this. The Black Knight in Europe was not an accident. He was a continuation. From Nubian archers holding the Nile, to Ethiopian horsemen riding highlands, to Sahel warriors cutting across the desert. The idea of the African in armor is older than Europe's memory of itself. So when you see that brother standing in a European hall, mail coif on, gauntlet strapped, crest on his chest, that's not diversity. That's overflow. That's Africa's war tradition walking into their story, and refusing to sit in the back. They told you knights were white, kings were white, saints were white, history was white. And you believed it because the pictures were edited and the teachers were scared to lose their own reflection. But we're here now, we calling names, we dragging shadows into the sun, we peeling Europe's fingers off the narrative it tried to lock in the vault. You've met the armor, you've met the lie. Next, we step closer, we look these men in the eyes, we tell their stories the way they should have been told, with spine, with context, with no apology. Because once you see black knights in Europe, you stop asking, did we belong there? And start asking, who tried to erase us? And why were they so afraid of us being seen? See, Europe been sold to you like a snow globe, all white, all cold, all pure, all civilized. Castles on hills, queens in pearls, knights in shining armor with skin like winter. That's the movie. That's the myth. That's the bedtime story they tucked the world into. But let's pan the camera back. While Europe was choking on plagues, mud, and church smoke, Africa was writing in gold and geometry. While they were stacking stones to build one lonely castle, we were laying out cities with avenues, water systems, libraries, and laws. While they were praying for the sun to come back after every long winter, we were charting the sun's dance across the sky, mapping stars, naming seasons, timing floods like a drummer who never misses the downbeat. They tell you Europe was the center. Nah, Europe was the rumor. Africa was the source. So when a black man rides through their fog in full armor, banner snapping, horse stomping, sun catching his skin through the visor slit, that ain't random. That ain't diversity. That's overflow. That's the Nile spilling into their rivers. That's Timbuktu walking into their dusty halls. That's Kush, Mali, Songhai, Al-Andalus whispering through chainmail. Understand the contrast. In Europe, a knight was a rare breed. Land, title, bloodline, permission. In Africa, warriors were institutions. We had cavalry before their language had a smooth word for it. We had iron when they were still arguing about the shape of the earth. So when you see a black knight in Europe, you're not looking at a guest, you're looking at a shareholder, an equal at the table who walked in with his own recipes, his own still, his own god, and his own memory of empires they'd never even heard of. Europe was the stage. Africa was the training ground. Europe had castles. Africa had kingdoms. Europe had lords arguing over borders. Africa had trade routes stretching from the Sahara dust to the Indian Ocean waves. Europe had myths about dragons and saints. Africa had lineages of generals, scholars, astronomers, healers, people who could ride, fight, pray, and read the sky like a sacred script. So when a black knight shows up in their tapestry, in their coat of arms, in their stained glass, that's not a glitch. That's evidence. That's Africa leaving fingerprints on Europe's pure history. And that's why they had to bury it. Because once you admit black men wore their armor, commanded their troops, married into their houses, stood at their courts, you have to admit Africa wasn't some background continent waiting to be discovered. You have to admit we weren't just slaves in waiting. We were diplomats in transit, generals on tour, merchants en route. You have to admit that the same people they later chained once rode through Europe on horseback with banners, titles, and respect. And that truth burns their whole script down. Because if we were knights there, what does that say about the way they talk about us here? If we stood armored in their cold, what does that say about the fire we carried from home? Africa versus Europe? Nah, it's not a competition, it's a correction. Europe was trying to survive itself. Africa was busy building worlds. So when you see that black knight in the corner of a painting, half shadowed, no name on the plaque, remember that's not a side character. That's a portal back to a time when our presence in Europe was normal, respected, documented, until somebody decided the story needed bleaching. And once you see that, you stop asking, did we belong in Europe? You start asking, how deep did Africa run through their veins before they pretended we were strangers? Let's walk into that castle, not the Hollywood one, the real one. Cold, stone, smell of iron, sweat, wet wool, old prayers stuck in the ceiling. Now picture the hall, banners hanging, candles fighting the dark, armor lined up like sleeping soldiers, and in that shine of steel you see him, a black knight, not a sidekick, not a whisper in the corner, not the exotic extra they toss in for diversity points. Nah, a lord of war, a man with land, rank, and a coat of arms that meant something when trumpets blew and horses stomped the earth like thunder. Europe wants you to picture itself as pale as its winters, but history remembers its summers too, and summer has our skin. They don't tell you about the Moorish riders who moved like shadows through Spanish hills, or the black mercenaries who sold their sword to kings who didn't care what color you were as long as you bled for their flag. They don't tell you about the dark faces in chainmail, standing guard at stone gates, speaking 3 tongues, switching from Arabic to Latin to the local dialect like it was nothing. Meanwhile, Africa was a different script altogether, while Europe was muddy boots, frozen felds, and plagues they couldn't spell yet. Africa was libraries in Timbuktu, gold dust on fingertips, mathematics carved into stone, cities lit by trade routes that fed the world. They had castles, we had kingdoms, they had knights sworn to lords, we had warriors sworn to ancestors. They swung swords for survival. We carried spears with stories etched into the wood. But don't get it twisted. Our people walked both worlds. Some rode out of Africa with the desert wind at their backs, crossed the sea, and stepped onto European soil like another land, another throne. Let's see who really knows the art of war. So you got black knights kneeling at altars and stone chapels, praying in Latin with African hearts, fighting for coats of arms while carrying the memory of sons Europe had never seen. You got black captains commanding pale soldiers, calling out orders in a language that didn't even exist when Kush was rising, when Axum was trading, when Ghana's gold made caravans crawl like ants across the Sahara. Contrast that. Europe, cold rain, wooden shoes, smoke in one-room huts, priests warning of hellfire they couldn't describe without stealing imagery from places they'd never been. Africa, courtyards with shade trees, scholars debating under the sun, astronomers reading the sky like scripture, queens wrapped in fabric so loud they made the drum jealous. Yet somehow, when a black man shows up in their paintings, on their coins, in their stained glass, they call him mysterious. Mysterious? No. Recognized. Recognized as the warrior you call when the enemy doesn't flinch. Recognized as the rider who doesn't fall when the battlefield turns to mud and screams. Recognized as the man whose ancestors mapped stars while yours were still arguing about whether washing was witchcraft. So when you see those black knights in European art standing tall in armor that gleams like moonlight on obsidian, understand that's not an accident, that's not a cameo, that's a fingerprint. Africa's fingerprint pressed deep into Europe's story before the editors came through with white ink and nervous hands trying to erase what stone, paint, and memory refused to forget. They'll tell you it was rare. But rare doesn't get carved into cathedrals. Rare doesn't get minted into coins. Rare doesn't show up over and over and over until the only way to hide it is to pretend you can't see. So now the question ain't, were we there? The question is, how loud was our presence before they turned the volume down? How many black knights rode into battle with lion hearts and African blood, while Europe tried to claim them as foreign curiosities instead of sons of a continent that fed their faith, their science, their philosophy, their very idea of what a noble man could be? Because once you see that armored silhouette, that dark face under a steel helm, you realize Europe wasn't just guarded by Europe. Sometimes the last line of defense between their walls and the grave was a black man on a war horse, breathing cold air, eyes burning with the memory of hotter suns. And that's the part they don't like to picture. When Europe was on the edge, Africa held the line. They'll show you their castles, their crowns, their cold stone cathedrals pointing at heaven like they own the sky. They'll talk about chivalry, honor, noble bloodlines, like the only courage worth remembering was written in Latin on parchment behind monastery walls. But step outside those stained glass stories and listen closer to the clash of iron, the scream of war horses, the prayers muttered through broken teeth. 'Cause when the banners tore, when the trumpets cracked, when the snow turned red and the ground shook, Europe didn't just call on pale saints and pale swords. They called on men who carried desert heat in their veins, who knew how to ride through dust storms and dynasties, who could read the wind like scripture. Black knights, real ones, not Disney, not sidekicks, not background. Men who rode in under foreign flags, but carried Africa in their posture, in their patience, in the way they held a spear like a second language. Europe was stone, cold, rigid, afraid of the dark. Africa was fire, moving, alive, at home in the night. Europe built walls to keep the world out. Africa built roads that tied worlds together. Europe crowned kings, then begged the church to bless their fear. Africa crowned empires that traded gold, salt, science, and stars, then sent sons to ride beyond the horizon. So picture that field. On one side, a trembling kingdom praying its borders would not break. On the other, a black rider sitting tall in the saddle, cloak snapping like a warning, skin dark as the soil every empire returns to. His presence alone was a contradiction they couldn't explain. How can the man you fear be the man who saves your city? How can the face you mock be the face that stands between your children and the grave? They called him Moor, Saracen, Ethiopian, anything but what he truly was. A son of a continent they tried to shrink to chains and cartoons, but whose shadow still falls over their proudest chapters. Understand this. While Europe was stumbling through plagues and power struggles, Africa was sending men who knew geometry of battle, who'd studied the rhythm of the war from Timbuktu to the Mediterranean. While Europe whispered legends of dragons, Africa was producing living fire. Black steel, black strategy, black resolve, riding straight into the storm with no promise of a song afterward. And when the dust settled, the scribes dipped their quills and started erasing. Turned black generals into mysterious strangers, turned black knights into shadows in the margins, turned African blood into anonymous ink on nameless pages. But history got memory, like a drumbeat. You can bury the story, but you can't silence the echo, because somewhere, beneath those European ruins, under broken towers and crumbled walls, the ground still remembers the weight of a black warhorse, the thunder of hooves, the command in a voice that crossed seas and centuries. Europe wrote itself as the hero. Africa was cast as the distant backdrop. But if you pull the camera back, widen the frame, and let the truth step into the light, you'll see it clear. Their survival more than once had our fingerprints on it, our sons in their armor, our courage in their chronicles, even when they scratched our faces out the frame. So no, Africa was not a footnote to their story. Africa was the reason some chapters didn't end in smoke and silence. And the day you accept that, the whole map shifts, the whole myth cracks, and those stone castles don't look so invincible anymore. Picture this. Europe, the so-called center of the world, was limping. Plagues in the streets, mud on their boots, cold in their bones, and fear in their prayers. They had kings who couldn't read, priests who couldn't wash, and knights who thought bathing was a rumor. But they had armor, so they thought they had honor. Now spin that globe south. Africa. Libraries so tall they scrape the questions out your soul. Cities mapped in gold and geometry. Doctors stitching bodies while Europe was still trying to figure out what disease even was. They had marble dreams and mud realities. We had sunlit universities and moonlit markets. They wore rust. We wore silk. They swung steel. We moved in science. So when Europe started choking on its own chaos, guess who they called when they needed real muscle with real mind and real discipline? Enter the Black Knights. Not bedtime stories, not Netflix fantasies, men of flesh and legend, Moors, Nubians, Ethiopians, sons of empires that made the desert read books and the savannah speak numbers. They rode into Europe like walking contradictions, dark skin and shining metal, African tongues speaking European oaths, sun-kissed faces under gray northern skies, and everywhere they went, the myth got nervous. Because how are you going to preach white purity when the sharpest sword in your kingdom is held by a black hand? How are you going to brag about noble blood when the bravest warrior on your battlefield prays in a language you once called savage? See, Europe had castles. Africa had civilizations. Europe had knights. Africa had warrior scholars, men who could quote scripture, calculate the stars, and still ride into combat with the calm of a surgeon and the faith of a monk. So when those black knights stepped onto European soil, they didn't just bring muscle, they brought memory. Memory of cities where law meant something. Memory of courts where women spoke and ruled. Memory of trade routes that fed half the known world. They weren't just there to swing swords. They were there to hold standards, and Europe knew it. That's why the painters started getting nervous with their brushes. That's why the scribes got shaky with their pens. You'll see them sometimes in the background of old paintings. A dark face behind a pale king, a black rider on the edge of the frame, a shadow they tried to blur into the scenery. Because if you center him, if you say his name, if you admit that the man in armor saving your kingdom ain't from your snow-soaked bloodline, then the whole fairy tale starts coughing up truth. Europe told its children, we stood alone against the darkness. But the darkness they feared wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes the darkness was the cavalry. Sometimes the darkness was the shield between their cities and the grave. Understand the contrast. They were surviving. We were advancing. They were patching wounds. We were building worlds. They were praying for a miracle. We were the miracle on horseback. Black knights didn't just ride through their wars. They rode through their stories, left hoofprints in their legends and fingerprints on their bloodlines. But when the dust settled, when the crowns felt safe, when the enemies were buried and the borders were quiet, the same Europe that needed black steel and black strategy suddenly developed amnesia. Names vanished. Faces got lightened. Coats of arms got refined. And the Black Knight, the one who held the line, who guarded their kings, who bled for their banners, got pushed from the throne room to the footnote, from the portrait to the rumor, from history to maybe. But the past ain't a contract they can just edit. It's a crime scene with evidence they keep tripping over. Old chronicles mentioning Saracen knights, family crests with Moorish heads, songs about dark riders who never lost a charge. They tried to bury it, but some truths refuse to rot. So when you hear medieval Europe, don't just picture pale faces in chainmail posing under cloudy skies. Remember the contrast. Remember the desert suns and northern snow. Remember the African riders guarding foreign thrones. Remember the Black Knights whose very existence turns Europe's favorite myth into a half-finished sentence. Because once you let them back into the frame, once you say out loud that some of the strongest European heroes were stamped with African melanin, those stone castles start looking less like monuments and more like borrowed stages where Africa once walked on, did the heavy lifting, and walked off without the credit. And we're here now to collect. See, Europe loves to talk like it was born in armor, like it woke up one morning already wearing steel and glory. But strip the fairy dust, wipe off the museum glass, and you'll see fingerprints they don't want to claim. Picture it. Fog over a cold French field, trumpets crying in the gray, banners flapping like tired prayers, and riding through that mist. Not just pale ghosts and shiny helmets. Nah. You had black knights cutting through that chill like a sunrise that refused to ask permission. Helmets off, brown faces, dark beards, hair curled tight like home. You think Europe built all that muscle on boiled potatoes alone? Africa was in the bloodstream, in the cavalry, in the code of honor they now call chivalry, like they cooked it from scratch. Let's talk contrast. Europe was castles of stone, moats of mud, kings clutching land like scared children clutching blankets. Africa was libraries that made Europe's shelves look like starter packs, cities with streets so clean they reflected starlight, gold so common it walked the markets like it paid rent there. Europe was crusades marching under crosses while erasing whole worlds in the name of a god they barely understood. Africa was empires where science, spirit, and sword shared the same table, where scholars and soldiers both bowed to wisdom before they bowed to any throne. But history class acts like Europe was the teacher and Africa was the dropout. Tell that to the Moorish riders whose horsemanship made European knights look like kids on training wheels. Tell that to the black captains who held the line in battles you only hear half the story about, where they mention the victory but not the melanin that delivered it. They'll show you a tapestry with a faceless knight in the corner, shaded just a little darker, no name on the scroll, no story in the caption. That's how they do it. They keep the armor, erase the ancestor. Europe gets the legend. Africa gets the edit. But the truth rides different. Because when a black knight stepped onto that battlefield, it wasn't just Europe fighting. It was Kush and Kemet, Ghana and Mali, Songhai and Moors, every buried dynasty swinging through that blade. You call it a joust. We call it memory in motion. You call it a tournament. We call it a lost chapter trying to shout through a stitched-up mouth. And here's the part that keeps them up at night. Once you admit there were black knights in Europe's story, you gotta admit Africa wasn't just the place they stole from. Africa was the co-author, the ghostwriter, the uncredited lead in a film they swear was all theirs. Europe was the stage. Africa was the presence. Europe had the script. Africa brought the soul. And when the curtain fell, they kept the applause, left us in the shadows and pretended we were never there. But echoes don't stay quiet forever, and armor remembers the weight of the body that wore it. We're just here to tap the metal, wake the ghosts, and say, "Step forward, Black Knight." They tried to bury your name under stone and snow, but Africa remembers. And when Africa remembers, history has to answer. Europe loves to tell you it was the only one wearing armor in the dark, as if Africa was just beating drums in the bush while castles rose from white stone. Nah, let's clear the smoke. While Europe was still learning to bathe regular, Timbuktu had libraries that looked like oceans made of pages. While knights were swearing oaths in cold stone chapels, African generals were drawing war lines with gold dust on the floor. They painted Europe as the land of chivalry, honor, shining steel, and pale men on pale horses riding through the mist. But if you listen close, you'll hear hooves they don't mention. You'll see faces they never painted. Black knights, real ones, some wearing crosses, some wearing crescents, some just wearing that unbothered African face under a foreign helmet. See, Europe was a storm, but Africa was the thunder behind it. Europe had castles of stone. Africa had cities of sun-dried brick and minds so sharp they cut through centuries. Europe had a few kings fighting over snow and salt. Africa had empires where gold walked the streets like it paid rent. So, when a black Man showed up in Europe on a war horse, draped in iron and leather. They called him Moor, like that word could shrink him. But that wasn't a name, that was a blur, a lazy label for everything they didn't understand and couldn't erase. Moor meant, you don't belong in this painting, but we can't deny you were here. Moor meant, we see your skin, but can't afford to tell your story. Moor meant, you broke through the snow like a memory of the sun. Understand this. Europe wrote itself as the main character, the only knight at the table. But you can't guard borders from Spain to Sicily, from the Crusades to courtrooms, without black steel standing in the shadows. They'll show you a white knight fighting a dragon, but they won't show you the black knight guarding a gate, commanding a regiment, marrying into noble blood, or walking through a market where every eye knew he was both feared and needed. Because if they show you that, they gotta admit something heavy. That Africa didn't just visit Europe. Africa helped build the stage Europe now performs on. That the same continent they call dark lit up their science, their medicine, their maps, and yes, their armies. Picture it. Snow on the ground, breath like smoke in the air, steel ringing in a foreign tongue. Then out of the white blur, a black knight rides through, cloak snapping like a flag, eyes calm, face carved from a different sun. To Europe, he was an exception. To Africa, he was a son on assignment. They'll say, maybe there were a few. We say, count again. Check the coats of arms with faces shaded just a little darker. Check the church murals where a black soldier stands at the edge of the frame. Check the family trees that suddenly go quiet when you hit a certain century. That silence, that's where the Black Knight stands. Because Europe was busy painting itself as pure snow and silver, while Africa was the iron in the blood of its history. So when we call them forth now, it's not fantasy, it's collection. We're not begging Europe to recognize anything. We're just reminding the world. Armor never made a man noble. Bloodline never made a man brave. But if you see a black man on foreign soil, holding the line, commanding respect in a land that fears his shadow, understand, that's Africa moving through history like a quiet storm. And the storm has receipts. Europe loves to paint itself as the center of the story. Snow on the rooftops, crosses in the air, knights in shining armor with hair the color of wheat and eyes like frozen rivers. That's the picture they sold. Posters, movies, textbooks, same tired casting call, medieval Europe, all white all the time. But history? History been side-eyeing that lie. Because if you listen close, past the church bells and the clank of steel, you'll hear another rhythm moving under their cobblestone myths. See, while Europe was choking on plagues and praying the sky would forgive it, Africa was mapping stars, building cities that glowed at night, stacking libraries like fortresses of thought, trading gold like it was pocket change, and wisdom like it was air. They had castles, we had kingdoms, they had knights, we had warriors who didn't need a last name to be remembered. They swung swords for a king. We carried nations in our spine. So when a black knight shows up in their dusty scrolls, they call him exotic, like he wandered in by accident, like he didn't come from a land where royalty was normal and courage was standard issue. Nah, understand the contrast. Europe was trying to survive the night. Africa was arguing philosophy at dawn. Europe was stacking stone walls out of fear. Africa was stacking stone wonders out of vision. So when a black man rides into their story, armor catching that pale sun, crest on his chest, banner in his fist, he's not a guest. He's a reminder. A reminder that before their castles, we had empires. Before their bloodline titles, we had bloodlines that stretched across deserts, rivers, and memory. They called him a knight. Cool, but understand that was Europe's language, trying to name something older than their calendar, because a black knight in Europe ain't just a soldier. He's a glitch in their script, a crack in their mirror, proof that the world was never as small as their stories made it. Picture it, A hall of pale faces, tapestries of saints and battles, candles flickering like nervous eyes. And then he walks in, skin like the soil their ships would later steal, presence like a drumbeat they couldn't quite place. Some stare, some whisper, some clutch their faith a little tighter, but all of them feel it, the balance shift, because that's not just a man in armor, that's Timbuktu stepping into their chapel, that's Kush riding through their courtyard, that's Mali sitting at their table, calm, unbothered, like, pass the bread, we've seen better feasts. He's standing in a world that swore he didn't exist, and yet there he is, commanding troops, holding rank, signing treaties, burying enemies who never thought his kind would stand above them. Europe writes him as a footnote. Africa recognizes him as a symptom of what happens when the continent that fed the world starts spilling over its borders. So when you hear of a Black Knight in medieval Europe, don't shrink him down to a trivia fact or a fun little secret of history. See him for what he is. Africa, armored up, walking through the fog of Europe's confusion, uninvited but undeniable. The land of droughts and diamonds, drums and dynasties, standing in a foreign court like, you can rewrite the paintings, you can bleach the legends, but you can't edit me out the past. I'm already there. That's the contrast. It said that they had winter, we had wisdom, they had myths, we had memory, and every Black Knight they tried to hide is just another receipt falling out the pocket of a lying world. Europe had castles, Africa had kingdoms, they had stone walls, we had living cities carved into the earth, palaces that breathed with the sun, libraries where the dust was wiser than half their kings. They had coats of arms stitched on borrowed glory. We had lineages etched in bone, sung in blood, carried in names that still taste like thunder when you say them right. They had knights swearing oaths to men who barely bathed. We had warriors sworn to principles older than their calendar, disciplined under stars they hadn't even charted yet. They had Europe, cold, feudal, muddy roads and plagues in the water, crowns sitting on trembling heads, terrified of the dark. We had Africa, empires that bent rivers into trade routes, gold that glowed so bright it rewrote their maps, armies that moved like a single drumbeat across the Sahel dust. They called our nights Moors, like a blur, like a rumor, like a shadow that snuck into their stories when the candle burned low. But those weren't shadows. Those were black men on horseback, steel on their hips, sun in their skin, posting up in their ballads and battlefields like, yeah, we're here too, right around that. They painted saints with halos and pale faces, then slipped up and brushed in wool hair, full lips, wide noses, dark skin, glowing under gold leaf like a memory that refused to die. They carved Black Knights in their cathedrals, tucked us in corners high up in stone where only the curious eyes and the honest hearts would notice. They tried to bury the story under whitewash and revision, but stone don't lie. Pigment don't forget. Old songs don't change their lyrics just because new liars got the mic. Europe gave the world fairy tales, dragons, damsels, pale heroes in shining armor. Africa gave the world receipts. Tariq ibn Ziyad crossing into Spain, black generals holding the line, black archers shifting the tide, black nobles signing treaties there. Scribes tried to bleach on the page. They had fantasy. We had fact. They had once upon a time. We had ask your archives. They had bards paid to flatter kings. We had griots who would rather starve than twist a lineage. So when they tell you Europe was all white and shining in the dark, understand this. The dark they feared was not the night. It was our reflection in their armor, our presence in their legends, our blood in their family trees. They weren't just erasing faces. They were erasing evidence. Because a Black Knight standing tall in their history means their whole civilized savior story starts to crack, means the "we discovered you" lie falls apart in their own museums. means the student becomes the teacher right there in their dusty glass cases. Europe was busy inventing monsters at the edge of their maps. Africa was busy making maps they'd later claim as their own. They were scared of the unknown. Woe were the unknown, until they realized the unknown knew more than them. So remember this. When you see a black knight in their art, that's not an accident. That's not a maybe. That's a fingerprint, a confession, a glitch in the matrix of their made-up world. Because every time their brush slipped and told the truth, every time their chisel caught our profile in the stone, every time a chronicler whispered about a dark-skinned lord with land, with title, with armor that cost more than a village, the lie got weaker, and our memory got louder. They had myths. We had memory. They had Europe on a pedestal. We had Africa on the horizon, rising like a sun they swore didn't exist while it warmed everything they touched. And those black knights, they were not guests in Europe's story. They were reminders that Europe was never the whole world. Just one chapter in a book we started long before they could read. Europe wrote its tales in gray stone fog and frostbite. Africa, we carved our stories in sunfire, gold dust, and drumbeat. They had castles damp with cold air and candle smoke. We had cities that glowed like constellations on the ground. Timbuktu, Great Zimbabwe, Benin, names they still mispronounce, but could never erase. They brag about knights sworn to lords and fragile crowns. We moved with warriors sworn to principle, to people, to ancestors watching from behind the stars. In Europe, a knight rode out for a king's approval, a lady's favor, a scrap of land. In Africa, a rider left the gates carrying whole trade routes in his shadow. Salt, gold, ivory, knowledge wrapped in cloth, libraries walking on 2 feet. They wore steel to hide their fear. We wore confidence like a second skin. Listen, when those black knights crossed into Europe, they didn't step up from nothing. They stepped down from empires, down from Mali's wealth that made kings in Europe look like village chiefs counting copper, down from Songhai's order that made their kingdoms look like backyard quarrels, down from Nubian and Ethiopian lines that measured time in centuries, not rains that broke every other winter. So when they rode through Europe, armor gleaming, skin dark as polished onyx, they were not exotic, they were export, premium stock. Africa's finest on foreign soil, Europe had stories about dragons and demons beyond their pale borders. Then Africa walked in the flesh, and the myths started speaking back. They called them Moors, Saracens, foreigners, anything but what they were. Proof that the world was bigger than their maps, and blackness was not a footnote. It was the ink. In their songs, the Black Knight was a threat, a rival, sometimes a secret ally. Notice something? Even in their own legends, they knew, you can't tell a story about courage and leave Africa out. Europe had winters that froze the blood. Africa had suns that forged the blood into iron. Europe feared the dark. Africa understood it. We knew night was not emptiness. It was a canvas where ancestors paint. So when a black knight rode through their mist, he carried our midnight on his skin, our sunrise in his stride. Their bards sang of him in whispers, half legend, half warning. There are men from the south who ride like they've already seen how this ends, because he had. His people had watched kingdoms rise and fall like tides long before Europe even named its Middle Ages. Understand this, Europe was busy surviving plagues. Africa was busy negotiating with the universe. They measured fields. We measured horizons. They counted coins. We counted generations. They knelt to crowns. We bowed to something older, the drum, the land, the covenant between the living and the buried. So when you hear Black Knight of medieval Europe, don't picture some stray traveler lucky to be there. Picture Africa stretching its legs, testing foreign ground, letting the world know, we are not outside your history. We are the part you tried to write in pencil, hoping it would fade. But pencil rubs off, melanin does not. And every time a Black Knight's name slips through the cracks of their archives, it's another reminder. Europe was a room. Africa was the sky. And a sky doesn't ask permission to be reflected in someone else's window. But let's stay in that castle for a minute, since they love that image so much. Stone walls, cold halls, banners on the wind. They'll tell you Europe was the castle, civilized, enlightened, the center of the world. But step inside that stone box and look around. Torchlight, drafty rooms, mud streets outside, rats holding town meetings in the alleys. Now picture Africa in that same century. Gold weighed by the pound in Mali, scholars in Timbuktu writing books while Europe was still arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. They had knights, we had kingdoms, they had armor, we had empires, they had a noble class. We had whole cities where knowledge was the nobility. So when a Black Knight rode into Europe, he wasn't a visitor from nowhere. He was a messenger from a continent already in motion. Understand the contrast. Europe was rehearsing power inside stone walls, testing steel in muddy fields, writing shaky rules for who counted as noble. Africa was exporting power without begging for a stamp of approval, moving gold, salt, ivory, ideas like traffic on a royal highway. Europe, a room with a ceiling arguing over who could sit closest to a flickering candle. Africa, a night sky full of suns, each kingdom its own constellation, burning with a light that didn't need anybody's permission. So when they paint those medieval scenes and forget to color in the black faces, don't get confused. That's not history. That's insecurity with a paintbrush, because a Black Knight in Europe wasn't an exception. He was evidence. Evidence that their borders were suggestions, their whiteness a costume they stitched together later, once they realized how many black fingerprints were on their story. They want you to think Europe discovered Africa like a new flavor of bread. But the truth? Africa walked through Europe's front door in chainmail and silk, on horseback and on foot, with names they couldn't pronounce and histories they couldn't erase, no matter how hard their scribes tried to write around us. Europe was a room trying to define the world from inside four walls. Africa was the world before the walls were even built. So when a Black Knight's shadow fell across their stone floors, it wasn't just a man on a horse. It was the horizon itself stepping into their little room, reminding them, you can close your doors, you can lock your gates, but you cannot cage the sky that made your morning possible. Europe was still learning how to bathe regular, arguing about forks, calling dirt a perfume of the poor, stacking stone on stone to prove to each other they existed. Meanwhile, Timbuktu was humming like a brain on fire, libraries breathing in desert wind, ink running like a royal bloodline across pages they still pretend they never saw. They had castles, we had kingdoms, they had lords fighting over muddy fields, we had empires stretching like a yawn from Nile to Niger, gold dust in the air, mathematics in the marketplace, astronomy in the prayer call. They were naming plagues after years, we were naming children after stars. So when a Black Knight rode in, armor swallowing sunlight, crest stitched with stories older than their calendar, he wasn't some side character in a pale fairy tale. He was the rumor of Africa walking through their front door, a living contradiction to every lie they told themselves about who was chosen and who was chained. They saw dark skin and thought stranger, but the steel in his hand was paid for with African gold. The cross on his chest was carved by hands that had already mapped the movement of the heavens. The language in his mouth was braided: Arabic, Latin, Wolof, Berber, a whole caravan of tongues riding behind his teeth. They called it Europe. He carried a continent in his shadow, while their bards sang of dragons and maidens in towers. Our griots were reciting lineages back 10, 12 generations. No paper, no scroll, just memory sharper than any sword on that field. They were praying to be saved from their own winters. We were reading the wind, writing with rivers, building cities that glowed at night, without needing to burn witches for light. So when that black knight dismounted, boots kissing their stone like it was doing the floor a favor, the room shifted. Because deep down, even under all that chainmail pride, they felt it. This wasn't a visitor from the edge of their little map. This was the center they'd been taught to ignore, the source they'd been trained to forget, standing right in front of them with a visor down and history in his heartbeat. Europe saw a soldier. Africa knew a son, and every time his sword rang against theirs in that cold air, it was the sound of a bigger truth knocking on their stone skulls, whispering, "You are not the beginning. You are not the sun. You are just standing in the light of something older, darker, and far more beautiful than you were ever brave enough to name." Because while Europe was still wiping mud from its boots, Africa was already signing its name in stone. Before they had a sir, we had a pharaoh. Before they had a manor, we had a kingdom. Before their first church bell rang, our drums had already mapped the heartbeat of the world. They call it the Dark Ages. But let's be honest, the only thing dark was the lie. 'Cause while their castles were damp and leaning on superstition, Timbuktu was out here reading the universe in ink. Libraries so thick with wisdom, the dust alone could have taught a class. While their peasants froze under gray skies and bad Latin, we were charting stars in Mali, measuring shadows in Kemet, carving medicine into papyrus, turning geometry into pyramids that still make their architects feel like toddlers with toy blocks. They paint Europe as the center of the story, knights in shining armor, queens in silk, cathedrals kissing heaven. But step back, zoom out, and the picture changes. Their golden age was somebody else's afterthought. Their renaissance was Africa's memory rebooted. Those black knights riding through their fog were not accidents. They were echoes, living receipts of a world order they tried to bury but couldn't fully erase. They called them Moors, Saracen, strangers, foreigners, anything but what they were. Extensions of empires they'd been taught to fear. Proof that the people they painted as shadows could walk into their sunlight and outshine the whole scene. Picture it, a black knight on a white horse cutting through European mist. Armor catching the weak sun, skin catching their weak faith. Every tilt of his lance said, "I come from a place where the ground itself remembers more than your libraries." Every time he rode past their peasants, they saw something their priests didn't have scripture for. A man darker than their nightmares, moving with more grace than their angels. 'Cause back home, honor wasn't a storybook, it was law, it was rhythm, it was the way you carried your name and your people into every room, every war, every whisper. In Europe, a knight was a man trying to climb out of the mud. In Africa, a warrior was a man standing on a throne of ancestors backed by centuries of science, spirit, and statecraft. They had feudal lords, we had lineages, they had oaths sworn in cold chapels, we had bloodlines blessed under constellations we could actually name. So when those black knights crossed that water, they didn't come empty. They carried desert heat in their veins, Nile logic in their minds, Saharan patience in their stride, and a memory of home so heavy it bent the horizon. Europe saw a helmet. Africa saw a sun. Europe saw an intruder. Africa saw an ambassador. Europe saw a threat. Africa saw a mirror held up to a world that had forgotten who taught who. Because the truth is this: you can build a castle and still be lost. You can raise a cross and still be blind. You can write the history books and still be lying. But you cannot erase what stands in front of you on horseback, dark as fertile soil, eyes sharp as a crescent moon, moving like prophecy in borrowed armor. That's what rattled them, not just the color, the contrast. Their winter versus our sun, their superstition versus our science, their fragile story versus our unbroken line. And every time a black knight took the field, the land itself felt the tension. Europe, trying to pretend it was the first word, while Africa's echo rolled through its front yard, reminding everyone there was a whole sentence before this chapter ever began. Europe wrote the playbill, but Africa owned the stage. They called them exotic, strange, out of place, like black armor standing in a snowstorm was some kind of mistake, not a message. But look closer, those crests on their shields, lions, suns, crescents, palms, and stars. That's not decoration, that's memory wearing metal. Europe claimed pure blood, but its battlefields told another story. Black knights with Moorish names, Abyssinian features, Nubian posture, riding through their legends like a glitch in the matrix they couldn't debug. They had to tuck us into the margins, a Saracen here, a Moor there, a dark stranger in the corner of a tapestry, painted just dark enough to be suspicious, but not black enough to be undeniable, because undeniable breaks the spell. See, Europe needed the illusion. White armor, white virtue, white Christ, white king, white past, white future. But history kept leaking. In the scrolls, in the court records, in the coats of arms, in the saint stories where Ethiopian meant more than just a poetic flourish. They said knighthood is ours. But the code of honor? We were doing that when they were still learning how to aim a fork. They said chivalry is European. But respect for the weak, protection of the traveler, hospitality to the stranger, that's old African law, desert law, river law, village law. Before chainmail, we had chain of command. Before their crusades, we had caravans stretching from Timbuktu to Cairo, to the courts they bragged about in hushed Latin. And when black steel entered their stories, they panicked. So they turned black knights into metaphors, the dark one, the other, the test, the enemy who becomes ally, anything but what he actually was. Proof. Proof that Europe's borders were never closed, that their whiteness was never pure, that their history was never isolated. Proof that a black man could ride into their myths, sword in hand, crest on chest, and stand toe-to-toe with their so-called greatest sons, not as a servant, not as a background, but as a rival, a brother, a mirror they didn't want to look into. Because here's the part they never teach. While they were polishing their fantasy of themselves, Africa was busy doing the work. We were mapping stars while they mapped superstitions. We were building libraries while they built legends. We were writing medical texts while they wrote dragon tales. And when their plagues came, their famines came, their wars ate their own children, who did they send for? The same Moors, the same black doctors, the same strange scholars with accents and melanin they pretended didn't belong on their soil. Europe prayed to survive. Africa calculated the cure. Europe hid in stone castles. Africa opened stone universities. And yet, when the story gets retold, we get edited out, cropped from the frame, turned into rumor. But rumor doesn't wear armor. Rumor doesn't get knighted. Rumor doesn't leave a coat of arms hanging in a cold cathedral for 700 years. Those black knights were not accidents. They were echoes of an older order, a deeper script, where Africa was not a side character, but the opening scene. Europe tried to make us a plot twist, but we were always the premise, and every time a black knight's horse crushed European soil under iron hooves, it was a reminder. You can rewrite the text, paint over the face, change the name from Ahmed to Armand, from Yusuf to Joseph, from Malik to Miles. But the bone remembers, the blood remembers, the land remembers who rode across it. Europe had the scribes, Africa had the witnesses, and witnesses talk, even when the books lie. So now let's step out of the desert sun and walk into Europe's fog. Because while they were painting saints with pale cheeks and scripting lies in Latin ink, there was something moving in their shadows they don't like to talk about. Black knights, not sidekicks, not background extras, not servants holding the horse. I'm talking armor on, sword drawn, oath sworn, black men riding through Europe like walking contradictions to every lie you were taught in school. See, they told you Europe was white, knighthood was white, chivalry was white, civilization was white, but history got receipts, and receipts don't care about feelings. Let's start with the name they keep whispering wrong, the Moors. When Europe was choking on its own darkness, fumbling with superstition and dirty water, the Moors walked in from Africa like, move, let's show you how light works. From Al-Andalus. In Spain to the courts of Sicily, African minds and African hands built libraries, lit streets, paved roads, healed bodies, charted stars, wrote music, designed cities. And some of those brothers weren't just scholars, they were steel and strategy. They were knights, not the Disney ones, the real ones, the kind that stand at the front line when the horn blows and the sky goes quiet. Picture this, Europe, 1100s, 1200s, castles on hills, flags in the wind, cold stone cathedrals trying to touch a god they barely understand, and riding through that mist, beneath a helmet, behind a visor, a black face. Not a tourist, not a slave, a knight, sworn to kings who feared him, respected him, needed him. They'll tell you about Saracens in their old stories, like that word isn't a lazy basket where they threw every dark face they saw, but read between their lines. Look at their stained glass windows, look at their church carvings, look at their old banners and family crests. A dark-skinned saint with a sword, a black warrior on a horse, a crowned African head on a European shield. They call him Saint Maurice in Germany, patron of soldiers. But look at the art before they started bleaching him. Brown skin, woolly hair, African nose, armor shining like he just stepped off campaign. Ask yourself, why is the patron saint of European soldiers a black man in full military glory? Because Europe remembers what it tries to forget. They will say, oh, that's symbolic. Of what? You don't carve a whole black knight in cathedral stone by accident. You don't put him on money, banners, and seals if he's not real in your memory. See, Europe keeps its nightmares close, and its inspirations closer. Africa was the proof. Black steel, black strategy, black command. While Europe was still arguing about bathing, Africa had generals who could read the stars, calculate supply lines, and outmaneuver armies across deserts, coasts, and forests. So when Africans rode into Europe, through conquest, through alliance, through marriage, through mercenary coin, they didn't come as wide-eyed students, they came as experts. You think those kings cared what color salvation came in when their borders were on fire? They saw results. They saw victory. They saw discipline. So they knighted black men, gave land, gave titles, gave them command over white soldiers in white lands under white crowns. They don't put that in your textbook because that image alone burns the whole racial fantasy to the ground. A black knight in Europe means whiteness is not the default, never was. Just a story told so many times, they started believing it themselves. Meanwhile, Africa didn't need to fantasize. We had empires where kings rode with cavalry that shook the earth. We had cities where scholars and soldiers shared the same table. We had queens who commanded armies, not just waited in towers for rescue that never came. In Songhai, in Congo, in Nubia, warriors weren't props. They were part of a whole system: trade, law, astronomy, medicine, art. A warrior knew his lineage, knew his people, knew his god. Europe was playing catch-up. They wrote ballads about chivalry while still trying to figure out basic hygiene. They romanticized knighthood because reality was rough, muddy, and confused. Africa didn't need romance. We had record, we had rhythm, we had order. So when black knights walked European soil, that was Africa's echo, Africa's fingerprint. a reminder that the world was never as small as the map in your classroom. But here's the trick. Over time, the storytellers got nervous. The darker the memory, the lighter the paint. They started whitening icons, softening noses, thinning lips, brightening skin. St. Maurice goes from deep brown to maybe he just tans in the summer. Black figures in manuscripts get edited out in new editions. Family crests with African heads get explained away as just symbolic. Symbolic of what? Your guilt? They buried the Black Knight because his very existence argues back. He stands there in armor and says, I fought for your kings. I held your borders. I learned your language. I mastered your code. And I did it while being everything you now say could never stand this high. That's why they had to erase him. Because if a black man could be a knight in medieval Europe, then your whole civilization ladder collapses. No more Africa behind, Europe ahead. No more we brought progress to you. Instead, the truth, we've been everywhere. We've done everything. We are not guests in history. We are co-authors. Africa was the original kingdom, and Europe was the late student trying to copy homework while pretending they wrote it first. So remember this. When they show you a medieval movie and the only black face is a slave, a thief, or a joke, understand that's not history. That's damage control. The real story? Black knights rode through their past like cracks in a porcelain mask, letting the light in, and Africa watched. Africa remembered. Africa still has the witnesses, and witnesses talk. Next time you see a sword on a screen, a crest on a shield, a saint in armor on a church wall, ask yourself who's missing from this picture, and why were they erased so carefully? Because once you see the Black Knight, you can't unsee him. And once you can't unsee him, their whole illusion starts to tremble. And trembling illusions, that's where African core lives, right at the fault line where the lie starts to crack. See, when they told you the story of medieval Europe, they turned the lights down low on purpose. Spotlight on the castles, on the pale-faced princes, on the chainmail shining like frozen moonlight. But they never told you some of those knights took off their helmets, and the mirror whispered back, black, not metaphor, not spiritually black, not maybe he was tan if the sun hit right. No, black like Nile soil after the flood, black like a drum skin before the first strike, black like your granddaddy's Sunday shoes. They called them Black Knights, sometimes for the armor, sometimes for the mystery. But often, because Europe was trying not to say the quiet part out loud, Africa was in the room, on the horse, with the sword. You've been fed Europe as the center of the world, like Africa was just some dusty background waiting to be discovered. But history got receipts. You just ain't been shown the bill. Let's talk contrast. In Europe, they were bragging about chivalry, while peasants froze outside the castle walls. In Africa, empires were weighing gold dust like it was table salt, building libraries that made stone remember your name. In Europe, knights swore oaths to kings who barely bathed, fighting over muddy borders, over land that could barely feed them. In Africa, scholars in Timbuktu were debating the stars, mapping the unseen, writing books Europe would later discover and pretend they birthed themselves. In Europe, they painted saints with halos and scrubbed the melanin off their faces. In Africa, the divine walked in full color, bronze and obsidian, wrapped in cloth that caught the sun and made it bow. But somehow, when Hollywood rolls the reel, medieval Europe looks like a snowstorm. Everybody pale, every night the same face with a different wig. They edited you out the frame, then told you black folks came later. Nah, we were there when the drawbridge dropped, Moors riding through Spain like a new dawn on horseback, architecture so smooth stone started singing in Arabic, black generals at the edge of Christendom commanding armies that made Europe rethink its own courage. They don't like to talk about that. Because if you see yourself as knight, as strategist, as ruler, the whole "you're just descendants of slaves" script starts to sound like the trash it always was. Understand this. When Europe was clawing its way out of the Dark Ages, Africa was already in full color. Kingdoms with tax systems, trade routes stretching like veins across the continent, cities lit by gold and intellect. Europe had castles. Africa had civilizations. Europe had knights. Africa had nations that trained warriors, diplomats, architects of reality. So when a black man showed up in armor on European soil, he wasn't an accident. He was a rumor of the motherland, walking proof that the world was bigger than the story Europe told about itself. And that's why they bury this part. Because the image of a black knight cuts through the cartoon they drew of you. You're not just background rhythm, you're the main drumline. Picture it, a European battlefield, fog hanging low like a secret, trumpets calling men to a war they only half understand. And through that mist, a rider appears, armor dark as midnight, crest catching the first light of dawn. He lifts the visor, and the crowd's idea of European history cracks down the middle. Brown eyes, black skin, calm like a man who's seen bigger empires than this. That's the moment they don't want in the textbooks. That's the frame they cut from the film, because it asks too many questions. If black folks were knights here, where else were we? If we held swords, did we also hold pens? If we rode through Europe, what were we riding from? Or riding toward? See, Europe sells you this myth that civilization flowed one way, from them to us, from white marble to brown earth, from enlightenment to darkness. But the truth, the current ran both ways. Africa wasn't Europe's student. It was often the teacher. They just copied the homework and erased the name at the top. So remember this. Next time you see a movie set in the Middle Ages and the screen looks like a bowl of unseasoned porridge, no, that's not history. That's editing. Know that somewhere in a chapter they never assigned you, a black knight tightened his gauntlets, adjusted his grip, and rode into a Europe that pretended not to know his mother's name and trembling illusions. That's still where African core lives, right there at the fault line where the lie starts to crack, and the black knight rides out the smoke, not as a side character, but as living proof that the story was never theirs alone. We're here to drag those shadows into daylight, to put melanin back in the Middle Ages, to say it plain. Europe wasn't the only one wearing armor. Africa wasn't standing outside history's door. We were inside the castle, on the battlefield, in the bloodline, long before they tried to shrink us down to chains and cotton. Now that you've seen the knight, let's talk about the kingdoms that forged him. So here we are. We've walked through the smoke and steel, seen the Black Knight ride through their European fairy tales. Like a glitch in the Matrix they tried to patch over with white paint and silence. We've watched them crop us out the frame, blur our faces, rename our bloodlines, turn our grandfathers into mysterious Moors, and our grandmothers into exotic concubines instead of what they were, queens, strategists, landowners, mothers of dynasties. They told us Europe was a snow globe, sealed white and pure until slavery brought us in. Lies. We were already in the courts, in the armories, in the royal chambers, on the family crests. We were already in the story before they started editing the script. But understand this. The knight is not the peak of the story. He's the echo, the shadow of something older, deeper, darker, grander, because a knight is just a branch. We are the tree. Every black knight riding under a foreign banner was still carrying the memory of older sons, Kushite ironworkers shaping blades while Europe was still whispering to itself in the dark. Nubian archers dropping arrows with such precision that enemies signed peace treaties out of respect. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, stacking gold so high kings in the north started sweating in their sleep. Great Zimbabwe razing stone cities without mortar, like the earth itself rose up to say, I know who my children are. So when you see that dark face under a steel helmet, that isn't a side character, that's a messenger, a postcard from older empires, a walking rumor of the greatness they tried to bury. They'll call him Saracen, they'll call him Moor, they'll call him foreigner, mercenary, stranger. But strip away the costume, and what do you hear? The drum, the desert wind, the Nile at flood, the griot's voice, the mother tongue still humming under the armor, because the kingdoms that forged him weren't just places on a map, they were worlds, worlds where blackness wasn't a problem to be solved, but a standard to be met. In those worlds, a black child didn't have to squint to see themselves as royal, didn't have to dig through footnotes to find a reflection, didn't have to argue their own humanity on camera, on trial, on repeat. In those worlds, black was not a costume, it was the blueprint. But here's the twist. Those worlds aren't gone. They're layered under the present like old cities under new pavement. Every time you walk, you're stepping on buried capitals, erased languages, silenced libraries, and unmarked graves of genius. And that's why this history matters. Not for nostalgia, not just to say, we were kings, but to say, we were complex, we were messy, we were brilliant, we were flawed, we were fully human before anybody wrote a law to argue otherwise. They buried our kingdoms in footnotes. They shrank our empires into side comments. They turned our knights into background extras in their own story. But the thing about the buried, the earth remembers, the bones remember, the blood remembers. You can paint over the mural, but the wall still knows what was there. So when a black child today sits in a classroom and only meets themselves as a slave, a servant, a statistic, a problem, something in their spirit knows they're being shortchanged, because the soul recognizes royalty even when the textbooks don't. That's why we go back, not to live in the past, but to reload the present, to fix the lens, to stop walking into the future with a story that starts at our suffering and skips our sovereignty. Understand, when you know you come from empires, you move different. When you know your people rode as knights, ruled as nobles, debated as philosophers, built as engineers, you stop begging for a seat at the table and start asking a better question. Who told you it was your table? Because the deeper truth, they're living in our aftershock. The world still cashes checks our ancestors wrote in blood, sweat, and brilliance. From the iron in the soil to the routes on the map, from the numbers in their banks to the stories in their museums, our fingerprints are everywhere. And still they tried to make our history start with chains, with ships, with auctions, as if we were born in someone else's nightmare instead of our own sunrise. So this is where we flip it. When you see that black knight now, don't just say, wow, we were there too. Say, we were there before, we were there beneath. We were there beyond. We were the iron in the sword. We were the gold in the treasury. We were the strategy in the war room. We were the rhythm in the march. We were the story they couldn't fully erase, no matter how many pages they tore out. And if they couldn't erase us from the past, they damn sure can't erase us from the future. So let this sit in your chest. You are not a footnote. You are not a subplot. You are not the diversity character added in the remake. You are the continuation of a line that wore crowns and helmets, ink and armor, robes and chainmail. You are the descendant of people who prayed in temples, studied in universities older than their nations, traded across oceans, and stood in courts where your skin meant authority, not threat. Remember that the next time the world tries to hand you a tiny, starved version of yourself, remember that the next time they act like black genius is some rare meteor instead of a daily sunrise. Remember that the next time they tell you European history is over there and African history is over here, as if we didn't braid the two together with ships, swords, treaties, and blood. You are not standing outside history's door. You are the door. You are the hallway. You are the castle and the battlefield. You are the kingdom and the knight. And this story we're telling, it's not about making them comfortable. It's about making you remember. Remember who you were before they named you. Remember who you were before they chained you. Remember who you were before they buried you in lies. Because once you remember, you move different. You speak different. You dream different. You raise your children different. You build different. And that is what they fear. Not our anger, not our pain, our memory. So as we close this chapter, hold this tight. They tried to shrink us down to chains and cotton, tried to cut us out of castles and crowns, tried to lock us out of armor and legend, but we were always inside the castle, on the battlefield, in the bloodline, inside the castle, on the battlefield, in the bloodline, inside the castle, on the battlefield, in the bloodline.